It's lock and load. You all say that up here in Kansas, lock and load. Wasn't able to bring a lot of materials from AP for this weekend, but I did bring some catalogs. Be sure to check those out back there that lay out for you the products we have at AP for all ages. Remember also that we'll have a Q&A later this afternoon, so if you have any questions, be sure to jot those down. This session in particular might bring up some questions for you. So in this session, we want to look at the second key event from world history that the Bible describes that is essential to understand if you want to properly interpret the physical evidence around us in the universe. And that is the biblical flood. So our last session ended with Adam and Eve's eviction from the garden, and obviously life on earth would be very different for humanity than it would have been in the garden, and Scripture is almost completely silent about the events over those next 1,600 years. And the second world, so to speak, the original world God created, and then after the first sin happened, you have a fallen world. Moses essentially pushes fast forward. We fly through the centuries up to the flood. The lifespan of the patriarchs from Adam to Noah are given in chapter 5. And so those Bible believers who believe in an old age of the earth, as promoted by modern uniformitarian geology, for example, have in some cases tried to add gaps into these genealogies to try to accommodate an old earth. And in response to that, besides the fact that dating methods, every evolutionary dating method that I've ever seen is based on the uniformitarian assumption, which is easily shown to be a terrible assumption in geology. And besides the fact that squeezing time into history, when humans are already on the scene, which is what Genesis 5 would be, that is not going to help with geology, and we'll look at that later. But also, the way that Moses states these genealogies leaves no room for gaps. Over and over throughout the chapter, he uses this simple formula. Person X lives A years and has person Y, and then X lives B years. And the total life of person X is A plus B. And so with this formula, Moses nails down the chronology tightly and allows for no gaps in this pre-flood period. So Genesis 5 is one of the primary biblical evidences that the earth has to be relatively young and doesn't accommodate modern uniformitarian thinking. So simple math shows that there's around 1,650 years from creation to the flood. And the New Testament, Jude 14, verifies that there aren't gaps by calling Enoch the seventh from Adam, which lines up with the Genesis 5 genealogies. Now, we can't know the exact number of years between Adam and the flood, because we know, for example, that Noah didn't have Shem on Noah's birthday. Shem didn't have Arphaxad on Shem's birthday, right? He didn't live exactly whatever it is, 500 years, and then has the son. There's some potential rounding of a few months there with each of these patriarchs. But assuming the Hebrew text is correct in its transmission, understanding that you also have the Septuagint and the Samaritan Pentateuch that gives slightly different numbers here, we can be confident that the span of time between creation and the flood is about 1,656 years, give or take about 5 years. So this is a chart showing the lifespans of each of the 10 patriarchs from Adam to the flood based on the Hebrew text that our Bibles are based on. So again, 1,650 years or so. Notice that Adam is actually alive to meet all the patriarchs except for Noah. Methuselah dies the year of the flood. We don't know that he dies in the flood, but he seems to die that year. The average lifespan, not counting Enoch, who was taken by God, remember, is 912 years. So how in the world do we explain that? This is a clue about life in the pre-flood world, that it was very different. A world which Peter, remember, describes as having perished. That world is very different. Remember that, thinking about what the world would have been like, the land itself apparently is configured differently, possibly being alluded to in Genesis 1:9. God gathered all the water together, the text says, into one place, possibly implying the land is also gathered. And you've no doubt heard of the idea of Pangaea, the supercontinent thought to have existed in the past that combined all of today's continents together into one. Alfred Wegener is often mentioned in association with the Pangaea concept, as though he's the one that came up with this, and he was an evolutionary guy. But it was actually a creationist by the name of Antonio Snider Pellegrini, who was one of the first to suggest that the Earth's continents seemed to fit together like puzzle pieces. And so he made this drawing in 1858. This is several decades before Wegener's on the scene developing continental drift. The idea that the continents drift around on the mantle. So Snider Pellegrini believed the biblical flood may have been what broke up the supercontinent. So continental drift has now been replaced in geology with the theory of plate tectonics, the idea that the entire crust of the Earth, even under the ocean, is broken up into big plates that move around on the mantle. Now, that puzzle piece fit of the continents isn't the only evidence for Pangaea. Today, scientists can use, for example, GPS, and in order to determine how fast the plates are moving and their heading. And from that movement, they're able to extrapolate backwards and reverse their current trajectories and get an idea of the continent's positions in the past. So plate tectonic theory is able to explain why, when the trajectory of the continents is reversed, they converge and fit together like this big puzzle that Snider Pellegrini drew. And plate tectonic theory explains why, when the puzzle is put together like this, there's matching rock layers and mountain belts on different continents, now separated by oceans. But when you put all of it back together, they continue across the pieces. The Appalachian Mountains, for example, of the eastern U.S., continue and become the Caledonian Mountains of northern Europe, for example. Plate tectonics explains why you have matching fossil distributions that go across these puzzle pieces that are now separate. So it has, and several other things, it has great, what we call explanatory power in science. The idea that it can explain a lot of evidence. But how would Pangaea fit with the Bible when the rate of motion that we see of the plates today is on the order of centimeters per year? It's as fast as your fingernails grow. So it would take eons for the continents to get to from Pangaea to their current position. And as is usual, modern naturalistic theories are based on erroneous assumptions. In this case, uniformitarianism. Uniformitarianism is the idea in geology that whatever is going on today geologically has always gone on in that same way in the past. There never was things in the past that happened that don't happen today. And so you just assume they didn't happen. Creation, that doesn't happen today. A global flood, that doesn't happen today. So you assume it never happened. You look at what's going on today, the present, understanding the present is the key to understanding the past, is the idea. So whatever rates you see going on today, the movement of the continents, the erosion of canyons, whatever it is, must have always gone on that way in the past. So cataclysmic events that you can't witness today, you assume that they never happened. So if the continents are moving slowly, they've always moved slowly, and therefore it would take eons for the continents to fit back together into this Pangaea form. Well, again, the Bible, we've already established, can be known to be inspired because it has supernatural characteristics, which means the flood happened, which means Uniformitarianism is false. You can't assume that things like the flood didn't happen and try to interpret all the evidence without the flood. You can't do that. So the geologic effects of global catastrophes in the past have to be considered if they could play a role in the evidence we observe today. So our objective at this point is to consider this when thinking about the pre-flood period and the implications of what the pre-flood world was like. And we see that it was very different. In fact, there's evidence of a supercontinent before Pangaea that may have been the original that God created in Creation Week. So when you piece Pangaea back together, again, we find that the Appalachian Mountains of the eastern U.S. continue into Europe and become the Caledonian Mountains. Now, when we examine the nature of the rock layers found in those mountains, we find that the mountains have layers in them that were deposited in the flood before they were buckled to form the mountain chain, meaning that the Appalachians aren't formed until the flood. Well, we understand that mountains form due to these tectonic plates smashing into each other. That suggests that there was a pre-flood configuration of the continents that converged to form Pangaea during the flood. And that supercontinent is sometimes called Rodinia. And also suggested by the fact that mountains form as these tectonic plates smash into each other. One of the things that we'll find as we study the flood is that the bulk of the Earth's mountains are likely formed during the flood, which again suggests a pre-flood Earth that was much flatter than today. Right? Something else then we learn about the pre-flood world. Perhaps, some higher elevation areas, but more rolling hills and plains perhaps. But regardless of what this Earth is like, we can't know much about what the original Earth's surface looked like beyond a few clues, because the remnants of the continents of the pre-flood world are very small and incomplete. God completely destroyed that world in the flood. The fossil record doesn't support evolution. It supports creation and the flood. I could do an entire session just on, I would say the fossil record is maybe the strongest argument for creation and the flood. It is powerful testimony to the truth of what the Bible teaches, although few people hear about it. It's the evolutionists that have a monopoly on that, and they paint a completely opposite story to what the fossil record actually teaches, except the leading paleontologists. The leading paleontologists are the ones that have actually highlighted that the fossil record does not support evolution. They consider it a major problem. But the fossil record tells us a lot about the pre-flood world, biology-wise. How so? Well, since we know in the geologic column in the fossil record where the flood begins, it's very obviously the Cambrian explosion down here. There's a lot I could say about that. We'll talk about that some later. And we know approximately where it ends at the top of the Cretaceous period there, the Cretaceous layers. Then by studying the fossils in those rock layers, we're getting a snapshot of what living creatures look like when the flood hits them and fossilizes them. And what we see is that in many cases, living creatures looked pretty different. Some cases not so much. Plants, we find that plants were abundant, grew to be large and lush in the pre-flood world. The trees of petrified forest out in northeast Arizona are trees thought to be from the pre-flood world that are torn up, buried and petrified rapidly due to the flood processes, transported to the area that they're found in now and uncovered. The immense coal deposits of the flood layers highlights how lush the pre-flood world was, how many plants there were. The rock layers in the flood seem to indicate higher levels of oxygen in the pre-flood world. Recall the enormous fruit still growing in Palestine a few centuries after the flood, when two Israelite men had to carry a cluster of grapes on a pole between them. And so that kind of thing was probably not unusual in the pre-flood world. The large reptiles of the pre-flood era, of course, are the dinosaurs, like this Brachiosaurus they had on display at the British Museum of Natural History. And you see me standing by him to show you the size of this guy. Here's a plesiosaur, so a marine reptile. Again, you see me over here for scale and how big this guy is. Insects were huge as well. We have fossil evidence of dragonfly-like creatures with wingspans of over 2 feet. the Meganeura, and this one's creepy. Millipedes that were up to 7.5 feet long. Arthropleura, I mean, you could ride this guy. Now again, evidence of much higher oxygen levels, as much as 35% oxygen in the atmosphere that would have probably promoted health, life longevity, size. All of these things we can learn about the pre-flood world by studying the fossil record in the geologic column. And there's even things we can learn about humans as well. We know from the Bible, Genesis 4, they're very intelligent from the beginning, unlike what evolution would say. They're already building cities, inventing musical instruments and various tools and stuff, using bronze and iron even, doing farming, working with cattle, all before the flood happened. We can learn about their appearance to some extent because while the entire human habitat of the pre-flood world is absent from the flood layers, it's totally wiped out. It was apparently completely destroyed. But we can look at what humans look like immediately after the flood and get an idea of what Noah and his family may have looked like, and we find there's a lot of variety within the humankind that's more than just skin deep, like the variety we see today with skin color, stuff like that. There's some actual morphological differences in the humankind immediately after the flood, as there is in the dog kind, the cat kind, every other general group of creatures. So evolutionists tend to give new species names to groups that share similarities that are just slightly different from other varieties that we would say actually all fit within the same kind that Moses is referring to. And so it is with Homo erectus and Homo demonesi, that you'll hear these terms used by evolutionists. Statistical and biological studies by creationists have revealed that Homo erectus is just a variety of humans from the past that had, for example, a little bit more pronounced brow ridge, a weak chin that didn't jut out like ours does, rather than the more pronounced chin that we have. And so this is what the fossil record seems to reveal humans look like immediately after the flood. And as mentioned earlier, humans are also able to live longer. Why is that? Well, we don't know, but we can postulate several reasonable factors. Possibly the lingering effects from the tree of life, less genetic degeneration at that time. So remember, the genome would have been created perfect by God and has since deteriorated significantly. There's been a lot more mutation and so forth in added to the genome. You wouldn't have had that at the very beginning. One of the things that I'm looking into is the effect of radiation on the genome that would have been caused by flood activity that we'll look at later as well. So the nuclear decay rates of the elements were accelerated by huge factors in the flood, releasing enormous amounts of radiation in a short amount of time and immediately after the flood for a period of time. So who knows how that could have affected the human genome. And what's more, besides plants and animals, we know humans of giant stature are walking the earth in the pre-flood world, and then continue to for some time after the flood, which we'll look at in a later session too. We know that after the flood, they could reach at least 6 cubits in a span, or what scholars believe to be about 9 feet 9 inches tall, which is Goliath's approximate height. Before the flood, they may have been capable of even more height. All of this, keep in mind, was possible within the genomes of just Adam and Eve. Adam and Eve's genomes would have allowed for this kind of diversity to come about from them later on. Again, we'll look at that a little bit more later too. And one final aspect I want to highlight about this period of time in the pre-flood world. So after creation week, before the flood, based on the genealogies of Genesis 5, we get a rough idea of how long people are living before the flood, if we assume that they're all living about as long as these patriarchs are living. And we find out how much time there is from creation to the flood, about 1,650 years. So with that information, we can get a rough estimate of how many people may have been on the earth by the flood, based on certain reasonable assumptions. If we assume that people lived 900 years on average and women continued having children for just the first half of their lives, as they do today, keeping in mind they may have been having kids for much longer. So instead of 450 years, they may have been having kids till they were 800. If they started having children at the conservative age of 25, and we assume that people live long enough to see all of their grandkids, so they live 2 generations, with those conservative assumptions in place, we see there could have easily been, on the low end, 215 million people on the planet at the time of the flood. Possibly many more. Some commentators have estimates much higher. Genesis 4:26 is the last verse of chapter 4, and it tells us that after Seth begets Enosh, men begin to call on the name of the Lord. And chapter 5 then gives that lineage of Seth and Enosh, the generations of individuals who were calling on the name of the Lord. And things gradually change over that next 1,600 years. The reason for the flood given in the text is that every intent or intention, ESV, of the thoughts of man's heart was only evil continually. Think about that. What it seems to be saying is, somebody might have done something good, but they didn't intend to if they did. That's pretty bad. I mean, it's bad in our country, but it's not that bad. I mean, there may be places in our country that are approaching that, but this was everybody. They did not intend to do good things. It was pretty bad. How did it get to that point? Well, the cause of that wicked state is given in verses 1 and 2 of chapter 6. The sons of God, which contextually here is apparently talking about the good people that it's been talking about in the context. Those, Genesis 4:26, that are calling on the name of the Lord. So these descendants of Seth, keeping in mind, remember, that there are no chapter divisions in the original. We've come and added those in there to make it easier for us. The good people that have just been talked about start to notice physical beauty and prioritize that in their marital decisions. So the good people start marrying the daughters of men, the carnally minded people, based on physical attributes instead of spiritual attributes. Let that be a warning to young people about what qualities you should be prioritizing in your dating and marrying decisions. Verse 3, notice the phrase, his days shall be 120 years, Genesis 6:3. Some have speculated, well, is this God setting a limit as to how long man's going to be able to live from then on? He's not going to live 900 years. It's going to be 120 years max. That doesn't seem to work in the context for a few reasons. Number one, commentator Albert Barnes makes a good point that man in this verse is referring to the single race of man, not just the plurality of individuals making up the human race. So the 120 seems to be referring to the life of the whole race of man as a whole. It's going to die in 120 years. Number two, man kept living beyond 120 for centuries after that statement's made. It doesn't make sense that that's what it'd be referring to. Number three, it would be strange to arbitrarily select 120 as the upper limit for life longevity and deem that as the punishment for their wickedness. And number four, keep in mind the point of this whole section. What are we moving up to here? The point of the whole section is to show how God ultimately punishes the world and wipes them out through the flood. So the punishment being referred to the 120 would seem to need to be related to that. So it makes more sense contextually to be saying, man is so wicked, I'm not going to put up with it forever. My spirit is not going to strive with man forever. In fact, I'm going to reach a breaking point. I'm going to give them 120 years to change their mind. And so Noah, you better get to work. And incidentally, when you look then at the text with that understanding, we see that Noah is 500 when Shimham and Japheth begin to be born. He's 600 when the flood came, so that's 920 years. So from that we gather that the statement made by God here in verse 3 is made before Shimham and Japheth are born, like 20 years before that. So God apparently made the decision to bring about the flood some 20 years before their birth and has Noah begin the process of moving in that direction. And he doesn't even have Shimham and Japheth until later. So they grow up, isn't that interesting? They grow up with the flood being, or the ark being built. You got to wonder, if Noah is being fruitful and populating the earth as he's supposed to be doing, as God commanded in Genesis 1, by the time he's 500, how many other kids might he have had that don't make it on the ark? Isn't that interesting? God instructs Noah to build a boat, a big boat, 300 by 50 by 30 cubits, and according to scholars, that translates to approximately a football field and a half long, 75 feet wide, 45 feet tall. He's told to make this ark out of an unknown wood called gopher wood, make 3 levels on it, have rooms in it for the animals, cover it with pitch so it doesn't leak, put a door in the side of it. God instructs him to install an opening, not exactly a window as we think about in our Bible classes, but according to the underlying Hebrew, an opening for light and possibly ventilation that apparently went around the top of this vessel and was a cubit in height. According to chapter 8, verse 13, a covering or awning of some sort is put over this opening as well, which is left until the end of the torrential rains. And then Noah opens this window-like structure to see the state of things after that. Now, importantly, God apparently actually sends the creatures that he wants on the ark. He sends them to Noah. Like Noah doesn't have to go out and hunt all these down, which is significant as you think about how is Noah going to know which representatives of the kinds are going to be best genetically to bring about the diversity that God wants, to make sure that their genomes are pristine and so forth. He doesn't have to worry about all that. A male and female representative of the unclean kinds of animals, and according to chapter 7, it seems to be 14 representatives of the clean kinds of animals. They come to him, which no doubt would have been at the right time. Imagine if they came early and he's having to tend all the animals while he's putting the ark together, right? They probably come at just the right time to board the ark. And so that's another place where it's just clearly a miraculous thing going on. God is sending these animals to him. And so they're coming. Some of these animals Noah may never have seen. Because one of the things we learned about the fossil record, about the pre-flood world from the fossil record, is that the pre-flood habitat seemed to be broken up by ecosystem more, where certain creatures live together away from other creatures. And so you've got creatures coming to Noah that he may not have ever seen before, coming onto the ark. Noah also brings food for his family and the animals. And after loading up, God himself shuts the door, which no doubt ensured a perfect seal where there wouldn't be any leaking. And then the fireworks begin. And so that brings us right up to the flood, the most catastrophic, violent, physical event in world history. And yet keep in mind, Psalm 111:2, God wants us to study these things, the things God has done, because they tell us things about him. They're worthy of our consideration. And the flood is, again, the greatest physical work he ever did after creation. And the Bible only gives us a few details about this event. It occurred 4,000 to 6,000 years ago. It was global in its extent, covers everything. The fountains of the deep burst forth and water comes from above. The mountains rise, the valleys sink. It lasts essentially a year, and that's about it. It's really not a lot to work with. So when we look up from the pages of Scripture and begin looking at the things that are made in the physical world around us, we begin to study this ancient work. We try to figure out what else can we learn? How do we make sense of everything out there in light of what the Bible says happened? Can we reconcile it with what the Bible said? And secular guys say, no, you can't. And, there's the evidence, for example, from geology fit with Scripture. Some have argued the flood just couldn't have been global because there's just not enough water on the earth, they say. They look at the earth and say, I mean, if the flood happened, where's all the water? Is it in the sky? No, there's not enough water in the sky. If you take all the water in the atmosphere, empty it onto the earth, it raises the sea level about an inch. Is it frozen in the ice caps? No, you melt the ice caps, it raises sea level about 230 feet. Is it within the crust? Well, that's a little more significant. There's an estimated 6 quintillion gallons of water in the Earth's crust today. You pump all that water onto the surface of the Earth, it would raise the sea level about 600 feet, 2 football fields into the sky. But notice we're not even up to 1,000 feet, and we've got mountains today that are 25,000 feet high. All right, so many of those who look at numbers like this and still want to believe in the Bible will reject a worldwide flood and say, well, the flood just had to be local. This wasn't a global thing. But as we'll see, that argument can't be sustained in light of Scripture or science. The evidence actually demands that this is a global catastrophe. All right, so we're going to look at what actually happened in the flood, and I want to start with a representation of what we think happened in the flood, a little video of that. It's the best portrait of the flood I've seen. There's a few key things missing from it, but it's about the best I've seen out there. Interesting, right? So modern creation science theorizes that much of the water in the flood comes from the oceans and from below the earth rather than just clouds above, which was once more the thinking. But keep in mind, it's also incorrect to think of the flood as only involving water. Now, the rain came down and the flood came up kind of a thing. That's the way I thought about it as a kid. The flood is a major geologic event. The earth is restructured. The phrase, the fountains of the great deep were broken up, is significant. The great deep referring apparently to the depths of the ocean. So we're talking about what seems to be the breakup of the ocean floor. Proverbs 3:20 mentions this as well, stating that the depths were broken up. And so the flood is a major geologic event. And notice that the text here says all the fountains of the great deep are broken up. There's more than one. And they're all broken up, suggesting again the breakup of the ocean floor. Well, the order of events is also noteworthy. The fountains of the great deep are broken up. That's mentioned first. Then the rain is mentioned second, possibly as a consequence of the first. So what initiates this chain of events? We don't know. Did God just miraculously snap his fingers and initiate the eruption of the fountains of the great deep? Did he use some kind of external physical entities like meteorites smashing the earth to break up the ocean floor? Well, there's a substantial amount of physical evidence that suggests a lot of meteorite activity occurred during the flood. We find a lot of meteorite impacts. Secular geologists tell us there are roughly 200 accepted meteorite craters on the planet that have been verified as being from meteorites as opposed to like a volcanic crater. And so when you convert the dates and the locations of these craters, look at which layers they're in the geologic column, convert that to the biblical time frame, we find that 57% of the confirmed meteorite impacts throughout Earth history struck during the single year of the flood. 57% of the confirmed meteorite impacts throughout Earth history struck during the single year of the flood. Another 23% of the confirmed meteorite impacts date to the period immediately following the flood, from the flood up through the Ice Age and up to about Abraham. 80% of the meteorite impacts on the planet occurred during the flood and during the following few centuries as the earth is calming down. I don't know about you, it sounds like that's pretty significant evidence that this is a part of what's going on in the flood, meteorite activity. Well, whatever starts the flood, regardless of that, creation geologists have tried to piece together what may have occurred after that point, based on what we understand about geology today. So geologists have determined that the interior of the earth is comprised of a solid inner core, a liquid outer core, and a mantle that is predominantly solid rock. The upper part of it has some plasticity to it, and then you have the crust upon which we live. So if we look at the crust, we look at the surface, geologists have discovered that the surface of the earth is broken up into big chunks, big pieces that are called plates. And these plates are moving around today on the order of centimeters per year, as fast as your fingernails grow. And so the earth is like a big cracked egg, and the earth is unique in that. It is the only known planet to have plates like this. So creationists believe that the cracking of the crust, cracking of the egg, may have occurred at the beginning of the flood and may be what started the whole thing. And it's interesting that there's recent articles by various secular geologists where even they are seeing evidence that plate tectonics may have been initiated by meteorite activity. And so the model that describes the motion of these plates and their effects is called plate tectonic theory. How do they know plate tectonic theory is likely true, since you can't directly see these plates? Well, several evidences, and I talk about these, by the way. By the way, I wrote the book Flooded, which we're totally out of at the moment, and I'm updating that book and adding like 65 more pages to it. It's pretty major additions. And so it's going to be probably 5 months before that's out. Anyway, I go into all of this in the book Flooded. And it's written on about a 9th grade level, so it's not real heavy, real technical. But anyway, you can check out the book for information about this. But briefly, we can use GPS to detect the movement of the Earth's crust. Geologists have used dating methods to get the age of the ocean floor. Now, the dating methods are based on terrible assumptions that they have extremely inflated ages because of what happens in the flood. It causes them to get inflated ages. But even though you can't rely on the actual dates that are given, the ages of the rocks, they do seem to at least tell you which rocks are older than others. And one of the things we find when we get the ages of the ocean floor rocks is that the ocean floor gets older the further you are away from mid-ocean ridge, for example, which suggests that new ocean floor is being made at the ridge, which is then moving from the ridge in both directions, which again is the idea of these tectonic plates moving. There's magnetic striping. So if you were to get a metal detector and get on the ocean floor, I wouldn't recommend that. You would die. But let's just say you get down there on the ocean floor and you're going along with your metal detector and it's detecting and you're trying to get readouts of the Earth's magnetism with that. You're going along these rocks, okay, they're pointing the polarity. Whenever you're looking at polarity, it's telling you which way north is facing. So your measurements are saying, okay, north is that way. And all of a sudden, you come to a next stripe of rocks and it flips, and now it's saying north is over there. It's pointing south. And you keep going, and then it flips again. Which, by the way, if the Earth's polarity is flipping back and forth, this is happening during the flood, by the way. That's pretty crazy. There's some major geophysical things going on, but from the perspective of just plate tectonics, this striping is actually mirrored on both sides of the ridges, again suggesting you've got new crust forming that is moving away from these ridges. So these plates are moving. Of course, probably the most obvious way to see the existence of these plates is if you mark the locations of earthquakes and volcanoes on the planet. And they very clearly make a pattern when you map these out. Why would earthquakes and volcanoes line up that way? Well, most geologic activity on the Earth is thought to occur along the margins of these big pieces of crust that are moving, that are called plates. And as they move, they rub against each other. And that's what causes earthquakes and volcanoes and mountain building. So as these plates move relative to each other, we see different things happening. Some transform where they slide past each other, like at the San Andreas Fault. Some will diverge, so they're moving apart, and then new material comes up from the mantle, coming into the gap, and so you see that at the mid-ocean ridges, for example. Some will converge where they're smashing into each other, and so like if you have two continental plates converging, it forms mountains. And if you have a continental plate converging with an ocean plate, the ocean plate gets pushed down, it subducts. We call that subduction. The ocean plate goes under the continental plate and dives into the mantle, and that forms rings of volcanoes when that happens. So mountain building is extremely slow today because the plates are moving so slow. So it would take eons at today's rates to form those mountains. So if mountain forming is happening today at such slow rates, then how can creationists explain the evidence in light of the biblical perspective? How can that be harmonized? Well, we looked at the idea of Pangea, a lot of evidence for that, the puzzle-like fit of the continents when they push them together, the fact that rock layers and mountain belts match across these pieces when you put them together, fossil distributions match. So the problem with the evolutionary view of Pangea is the time frame. They're assuming uniformitarianism. They're assuming slow and gradual movement of these plates. So using the actual evidence from geology and geophysics and plate tectonics, but without the hidden assumption of uniformitarianism, creationists have developed our own theory that is based on the biblical perspective. Instead of plate tectonics, it's catastrophic plate tectonics, CPT. So a young Earth creation geophysicist by the name of John Baumgartner laid the groundwork for this model back when he developed a supercomputer program when he was at UCLA doing his doctoral research in geophysics and space physics. And the program he developed was called Terra, and it helps to model the interior dynamics of the Earth, what's going on in the mantle. So based on the predictions of his program, other creation physicists and geologists and paleontologists and meteorologists joined him in developing catastrophic plate tectonics that describes, it gives a big piece of what we think happened, especially at the beginning of the flood. And this can get really technical if you do a deep dive into this. So paraphrasing the model, before the flood, the Earth's tectonic plates didn't exist, the continents weren't separated, and then at the onset of the flood, all the fountains of the great deep break forth, Genesis 7:11. So the plates break apart. And keep in mind, the fountains of the deep there may be referring to more than just fountains of water. This could also involve acid, magma, that would have been, the sulfuric acid, for example, would occur due to the lava mixing with water and oxygen, for example. So according to catastrophic plate tectonics, something causes the breakup of the crust. And so when we think about the ocean floor, the ocean floor is very cold. It's very dense. Okay, so when it gets broken apart, including breaking the ocean plates away from the continental plates. According to computer simulations, when that occurs, when you have the breakup of the continental and oceanic plates, there would have been a geophysics phenomenon occurred that they call not just subduction, but thermal runaway subduction, where the sea floor, instead of the creeping rate that it's moving into the mantle today under the continents, at the beginning of the flood, it is runaway subduction. It's diving into the mantle very quickly. So in 1994, when this theory is being developed, creation scientists made a prediction. If you've got a good theory, a good scientific theory, you should be able to make a prediction. We're not talking about a predictive prophecy. We're just saying if my theory is right and I go do this experiment or I go do this research, I should find this to be the case. So they made a prediction. So what they said was, okay, if uniformitarianism is true and the Earth is as old as they're saying it is, then the ocean floor has always been slowly diving in the mantle the way it does today, which means there's plenty of time for the front end of that plate to melt and recycle into the mantle. So you're not going to see much of the plate deep in the mantle. But he said if creationists are right, then this happened fast, and it was only 4,500 years ago. So there should be enormous piles of pre-flood ocean crust piled up in the mantle under these subduction zones. There would be evidence of the pre-flood world. Well, the technology wasn't available at the time to be able to look at what was under the subduction zones and look at the Earth's interior. We didn't have the ability to do that. Sure enough, 3 years after the creationist predictions, seismic images, technology advanced to the point where seismic images of the mantle's density structure verified creationist predictions and showed that there's evidence of enormous piles of cooler slabs of material in the mantle under the subduction zones, just as creationists predicted. It makes no sense from a uniformitarian perspective, but fits the biblical flood model exactly as we'd expect. Presumably, pre-flood crust that piled up in the mantle and hasn't yet had time to melt and recycle into the mantle. So this rapid diving would have caused all the plates, they're moving rapidly. Instead of centimeters per year, they're moving meters per second, as fast as you can run across the auditorium. So the supercontinent breaks up, it starts moving around rapidly. What's that going to do? Well, it's going to cause the rapid formation of mountains at convergence zones. It's going to cause the rapid formation of volcanoes at subduction zones. So you have to picture now a conveyor belt. So you got an ocean floor plate, and you got a continental plate. And so you picture this ocean floor plate diving into the mantle rapidly. What happens on the other side of the plate? Well, you have a divergence zone, so two plates moving apart. So new material from the mantle comes up into the gap to form new crust. So what's going to happen if you have extra hot magma hitting the ocean water at that point? Well, what happens if you take water and throw it on a campfire? It immediately superheats that water into steam, right? So, as this is happening, magma's coming up all along the divergence zones all over the Earth, most of which are in the ocean. It's stretched for hundreds of miles. Okay, that would have caused intense rain around the globe from that action, causing geysers to spew material hundreds of miles all over the Earth as water is erupting and from the fountains of the deep, causing this to occur. All right, now you've got new magma that is forming new ocean floor as this is going on. So you've got that conveyor belt process going. New materials coming up, gradually forming new ocean floor as the old plates are diving into the mantle. The whole ocean floor is being overhauled with new mantle material. All right, since it is hot, it is in an expanded state. When you heat things, they expand. Water is the one weird exception to that. Most things, you heat them, they expand. So you've got the entire ocean floor gradually being overhauled with hot material that's going to be in an expanded state. It's going to be less dense. It's going to be lighter. So essentially, the ocean floor is gradually now being overhauled with the sea level is being raised by this. And Christian geophysicists estimate that at the peak of the flood, it's about 3,500 feet or more higher than the pre-flood level. So what's that do? It takes the water from the ocean and pushes it onto the land, carrying with it sediment, carrying sea creatures with it, explaining why there are marine creatures across the continents, even in the middle of continents, far away from the ocean. You know, it's not as big a deal if you find, a shark fossil up at where I live in Alabama, in Montgomery. That's not really that far away from the coast. But you find them up here in Kansas, that's a bigger deal. You find marine creatures this far, and that is what we find. We find marine creatures far away from the continents that can't be explained in a uniformitarian perspective, by the way. Okay, we can go into that, but I don't have time to do it. Let's keep moving here. So water's coming in from the ocean as the sea level's rising, and you've got these immense geysers crashing onto the planet as well. As these tectonic plates are smashing into each other under the ocean, you've got tsunamis, mega tsunamis, rocking the coasts, obliterating the pre-flood world, eroding the rocks down to particle size that then gets spread across the entire continent as the enormous sheets of sedimentary rock that we find on the planet. So most of the water is coming from the ocean. And keep in mind, while all this is going on, you've got meteorite impacts occurring. So secular guys have developed simulations of where they think the various pieces of the continents were at different times in the past, their land configurations. And they have simulations that show how they move and so forth. And the big problem with it is the timeline. But if you ignore their timeline and set it to the creationist timeline, you actually get an idea of how these continents may have been moving during the flood. And keeping in mind that most of it is underwater while it's moving, right? Because this is during the flood. So I took one of their simulations, and then I took all the known meteorite impacts from the flood and where they struck the earth, and added them to the simulation showing approximately when and where the meteorites would have struck during the flood. And keep in mind, these are only the craters that have been discovered so far, and also obviously any meteorites that struck the ocean wouldn't have left craters as readily, which is why verified meteorite craters are land craters. We don't know what all's going on in the ocean. So to get a better idea of how many meteorites actually struck during the flood, you've got to add quite a few more. And so far, there's over 100 meteorite craters that have been found on the land that correlate to the flood period, but 70% of the surface of the earth is in the ocean. And so if you take what we know about the land and extrapolate to the ocean area during the flood, you have to add another 230 more meteorite impacts. So over 330 meteorites probably smashing into the earth during the year of the flood. So clearly meteorites are a significant part of this. Now notice Psalm 104. You covered the earth with the deep as with a garment. The waters stood above the mountains. At your rebuke they fled. At the sound of your thunder they took to flight. The mountains rose. The valleys sank down to the place that you appointed for them. You set a boundary that they may not pass, so that they might not again cover the earth. Now in light of verse 9, it seems clear this seems to be referring to the flood, not creation week. Otherwise, this passage was violated during the flood. Right? Because there's supposed to be a boundary to not allow the water to go back again. So assuming this is referring to the flood, it makes perfect sense. Because all of the high mountains are formed during the flood as these plates are smashing into each other. So the Rockies and the Himalayas, these are all forming as this is going on. And now, because of the formation of the mountains in the flood, it's now impossible for there to be enough water to completely submerge the earth again, just like this passage indicates. A boundary has been created by the mountains rising and the valleys sinking, which may be referring to the deep sea trenches that are formed at subduction zones while all of this is going on. So it created enormous valleys for the water that make it where the water can no longer get as high. There's not enough water to do that. Well, according to the text, the rain itself continued for 40 uninterrupted days and nights, but that's not the extent of the catastrophe, because the waters continue to rise for some time after that. And according to catastrophic plate tectonics, that would presumably be due to the ocean floor still being overhauled. And so it's still pushing more and more water as the entire ocean floor is getting higher and higher until it's completely been covered with new material. And so then the rising waters levels out and finally starts to decrease on the 150th day. This is 5 months into the flood before finally the water reaches a peak and starts dropping. And notice that during this catastrophic period, typical earth processes, seasons, day and night, and so forth, are totally disrupted. After the flood, God promises in chapter 8, verse 22, he's not going to allow that to happen on a global scale again. And so the disruption of the seasons as well as day and night would also be expected under catastrophic plate tectonics. So you've got cloud cover from more water, but also aerosols and volcanic ash in the air from not just from the meteorite impacts, but also because of the volcanic activity going on as this is happening. So that would have stopped day and night, blocked out sunlight, and with it summer and much of the heat that we would receive. Obviously seed time and harvest would be stopped while the earth is covered with water. So returning to the question that we asked at the beginning, how could the flood be global? How could there be enough water to cover the earth prevailing above the mountains even over 20 feet? So with this model I've laid out for you, you'll see the value of why it's helpful to have theories and models, because it can answer challenges. So let's look at the science side first. Remember that catastrophic plate tectonics theory would say that the water came primarily from the sea, both in the form of these geysers shooting superheated water up into the sky, and in the form of the sea level being raised as the ocean floor is being overhauled. So when we recall from Psalm 104 that the taller mountains are forming during the flood, and we recall from catastrophic plate tectonics that the mountains are forming as the plates are converging or subducting in some cases, then we realize that the pre-flood world could have been much flatter. And so notice it wouldn't have been nearly as hard to cover the land with water at that point, because the taller mountains we have today aren't formed until the flood, and specifically later in the flood is when they get high enough to be as high as they are today, and that's during the recession. So you picture a flatter earth, one with a lower elevation, covering the highest points on the earth, wouldn't require anywhere near the amount of water that it would require today. So where did the water go after the flood? Well, first of all, as the ocean floor is raising during the flood, and the intense geyser activities going on from the fountains of the deep, this is going to push huge amounts of sediment onto the continents from tsunamis and so forth. That's going to raise the level of the continents relative to pre-flood times. Plus, mountains are forming at convergent and subduction plate boundaries, where you've even got material from below the earth that's being pushed up, like in the Appalachians, during the flood. So the entire land, the continents, are going to be already higher than they would have been compared to pre-flood times. But then you got other implications. Remember that as the ocean floor is diving into the mantle, new material is coming up and replacing that. And that material is hotter, which means it's less dense. It means it's sitting higher in the mantle. It raises the ocean floor at the peak at about 3,500 feet or more. So this conveyor belt process would have then slowed abruptly after the new ocean floor has been totally made. That's going to stop the steam jets. And as that new material on the ocean floor starts cooling, what's going to happen? Well, it's going to sink again. It's going to, it's no longer going to be pushed up in that hot state. It's going to actually sink. It'll start sitting lower in the mantle, which then allows much of the water on the land to go right back to the ocean where it came from. So when you go to the coast and look at the ocean, you're looking at the waters of the flood. They just receded back to the ocean. Also, the valley sank during the flood, again, possibly referring to the formation of the deep sea trenches at the subduction zones I talked about last night. So these would have provided enormous reservoirs for water from the flood to go to during the recession. So bottom line, no problem from science in explaining where the water for a global flood would have come from and where it been. But there's other evidences of a global flood from science. The Cambrian explosion is, to all intents and purposes, in the fossil record where the fossil record begins. And it is an explosion across the whole planet. So if evolution is true, you would expect the first creatures to be simple, single-celled organisms. And you look at the layers above them, they should be a little bit more complex. And eventually, over time, they develop more complexity, totally different body types over time. Right? That's what you should see. You should see transitional fossils that connect them all the way back to that single-celled organism. That's not what the fossil record reveals. Right off the bat, you see an explosion of fully formed creatures. Some are simple, some are complex, like the trilobite, that has an eye that is more complex than the human eye. And it explodes onto the scene at the very bottom of the fossil record. Extreme diversity, actually it's called disparity, when you have creatures that are totally different, like different body types. They explode onto the scene in the Cambrian explosion. And then in the layers above them, by the way, they stay basically the same. So that's called stasis in paleontology. So there's abrupt appearance, then they stay the same, they don't evolve, and then they go extinct. Exactly what creation would expect would happen. That's what you see. So starting at the Cambrian explosion, which creationists almost unanimously understand to be, that's the beginning of the flood. Okay, you see a worldwide explosion of fossils across the entire planet. It's not local, it is global. The sudden explosion of life across the entire planet suggests a worldwide catastrophic event. And then you have what's called long-distance travel of sediment. So when you look at the material found in the rock layers of the geologic column, I go to the Grand Canyon, for example, and in many cases, the source of the material that's deposited there, where did it come from? It gets deposited there in the Grand Canyon, but where did it start? Well, they'll find that the source is located, in some cases, hundreds to thousands of miles away. Okay, now if you're thinking uniformitarianism, whatever's happening today has always happened in the past. Well, what happens today with material? Wind and water can erode rock and carry it relatively short distances, a few miles or something, hundreds or thousands of miles, and the final sediment deposits can be hundreds of feet thick, as tall as this ceiling. Okay, these again suggest a major catastrophe that is unlike anything that you see happening today. Then there's what are called seismites, and specifically megaseismites, and I'll probably talk about this a little bit later, but essentially evidence of unheard of earthquakes, as though the tectonic plates are smashing into each other way harder than they do today, which would be because they're moving faster. Other evidences, starting at the Cambrian explosion, so the beginning of the fossil record, the beginning of the flood, in what's called the Paleozoic strata. Okay, you have, starting at that point, not localized sediment. Like today, you might have areas, that's sand over there, and here's mud. You got localized pockets of different kinds of sediment. Well, starting at the Cambrian explosion, you have worldwide, like sandstone beds that are laid down by some kind of worldwide catastrophic event involving a lot of water. And you follow these layers across the U.S., you jump over the ocean, and the same layers continue into Europe. These, again, are not localized beds. They're global. They begin at the Cambrian explosion, and then you see similar worldwide beds like that continue up through the geologic column to the point at which we believe the flood ends, just at the end of the Mesozoic strata. And sedimentary rock is the dominant rock type throughout all of those worldwide layers. And sedimentary rock is understood to generally be formed from water activity. And they're worldwide. That's exactly what we'd expect. That's what we would predict. Remember Bill Nye the pseudoscience guy? He doesn't think creationists can make predictions. Well, whenever we move from science and we look at the Bible, we find that the Bible doesn't leave room for a local flood interpretation. Very quickly, if it's a local flood, why in the world are you building an ark over several decades? Why not just leave the area? And why would God send animals from all over the place? If He's sending the animals anyway, why not just send them out of the area? It makes no sense. Why do that if this is local? How would the ark even be able to stay afloat for several months, as the text says, if this is just a local event? This is a huge vessel. Any of you ever been to the Ark Encounter in Kentucky? By the way, I do. I bring groups up there, and I've got flyers about this. Anybody that wants to be able to go, I'll lead groups up there and show you what you're seeing and so forth, lead tours of that area. But anyway, you see how big that thing is. Okay, this is a local flood can hold that thing for months. How could the biblical terminology describing the water as covering the high mountains under the whole heaven, how can that be describing a local flood? How could water even get high enough locally to cover something that would be considered a mountain if the flood is not greater in its extent? How could the biblically stated purpose of wiping man from the face of the whole earth be accomplished with a local flood? Right? If it's local, you're telling me that humans couldn't just get out of that local area and not be wiped out by this? They've got decades, and they're not just going to accidentally be, on a vacation somewhere, and so they don't get wiped out by the flood or something? This is an important one. If the flood is local, then apparently God lied, because He promised never to destroy the earth again with a flood in the way that He did. Do local floods occur today? Yeah. Peter used the universal destruction of the earth and the flood to describe what Judgment Day is going to be like. So if the flood is local, then hey, maybe Judgment Day will be too. Why would the seasons have been affected if this is just a local flood? Where you've got seed time, harvest, winter, day and night stop during the flood? Doesn't sound like the effects of a local flood to me. Why would the dove have found no resting place for the sole of her foot? We know that doves can go huge distances. Okay, apparently, the flood is so extensive that the dove is not able to find a place for her feet. So the Bible doesn't leave room for a local flood interpretation. Either the Bible is right that there was a global flood, or the Bible's wrong and therefore not inspired. And those are your two options. And yet there's no reason to question the Bible's claim that there was a global flood scientifically, which is really where everybody's hang-up is. Science really supports it. It demands it. So this is a very different portrait of the flood than oftentimes we might think of in our minds. This was no pleasure cruise for Noah and his family. The water probably would have been more red than that, right? Okay, so in our next session, which is when? After lunch at some point?
It'd be
after lunch. Then we'll get to jump into what occurs because of the flood. We get to go into the post-flood ice age and how that's coupled with Babel. And then we'll get to start looking at some really cool things that you can make predictions about based on this. And remember, we're moving also towards a Q&A at the end of these sessions today. Tomorrow morning, we'll look at whether the flood model can withstand scrutiny. It can deal with attacks made by people like Bill Nye, the pseudoscience guy. So hopefully you'll be here for that as well. All right, I'll turn it over to you unless you want to do anything else. Thank you for your attention.
Well, thank you once again, Brother Miller. When you think about Noah and his family being on the ark, could you imagine the sounds they heard as all of that was going on between the earthquakes and the meteorite impacts? And that would have been horrifying. So I never thought of that before until you brought up the case about the meteorite impacts. That would have been something. We're going to break for lunch, so the session on the Ice Age will not start till 1:15. So it is 11:37 right now, and so we'll start the afternoon session beginning at 1:15. So just to let you know, we do have handouts in the foyers that detail restaurants and those sorts of things. There are a few restaurants listed on there that I wouldn't suggest going to because you don't have enough time. The bistro is closed, so it's not a lunch place anyway. And one of the other ones downtown, I think it's the one in the hotel. That one. It'd take probably a little longer. So, but be back here 1:15, and we'll begin a most interesting discussion on the Ice Age. So, 1:15.